Well, let me get started. And because I have a short introduction, the introduction is necessarily short because we are we're lucky to have giving this talk a scholar who has had a brilliant career and has been rewarded by having a number of titles associated with her name. You know that somebody is successful when their title takes up a whole line. I mean, my title is just two words, Edwards Professor, but she is the W. Hawkins Ferry Endowed Chair Professor Emerita of Modern and Contemporary Art History at Wayne State University. So, so you know you're in the presence of an outstanding scholar. She is a social critic and art historian who writes about politics, culture, and visual imagery. She's the author of 6 books, and that number includes Beautiful, Terrible Ruins, Detroit and the Anxiety of Decline, and also a book entitled Imagery of Lynching, Black Men, White Women, and the Mob. She has published widely in scholarly journals, and her work has been translated into Portuguese, Hungarian, and Polish. Her essay entitled Against the Ruins, Music and Black Space in Detroit was published recently in Electronic Landscapes, Music, Space, and Resistance in Detroit, and involved the photography of Isaac Diggs and Edward Hillel. Today's talk draws on her most recent book entitled Calling Memory into Place, which was published this fall by Rutgers University Press. In this deeply personal work, Dr. Apel explores how memory can be mobilized for social justice and how inherited trauma can be channeled in productive ways. She examines memorials, photographs, artworks, and her own experiences of illness and recovery, and as a child of Holocaust survivors, to explore strategies for unforgetting the past. The Midwest Book Review, in sort of characterizing this book, described it as an inherently fascinating, thoughtful, and thought-provoking series of insights and essays on the role of memory in processing personal, social, cultural, and political histories. Her talk today is entitled Why We Need a National Lynching Memorial. So I'm delighted that Dora Apel has graced this series with this presentation, and I now welcome her to the virtual podium.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Walter. So I'm going to share screen. Whoops. Okay. Can you see this, the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, so in this talk today, I want to argue that the principles of liberty and equality on which this country was founded coexisted with and were built upon the condition of slavery. And the legacy of this fundamental contradiction continues today. To exemplify this ongoing fundamental divide, I want to focus on the National Lynching Memorial and Companion Legacy Museum that opened in Montgomery, Alabama, just 2 years ago, and to examine how they produce an activist form of memory for this unresolved national condition. There are 2 versions of Montgomery, the old and the new, we could say. In the old Montgomery, the streets are named for Confederate generals, and there is a house museum called the First White House of the Confederacy, which you see here. It celebrates the life of Jefferson Davis as a great patriot in the home where he lived as the first president of the Confederate States. It barely mentions the hundreds of people that he and his family enslaved. Montgomery is also where Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of a bus for a white passenger, and where Martin Luther King Jr. and other activists planned the subsequent Montgomery bus boycott. Montgomery is now home to the Rosa Parks Museum, the Freedom Rides Museum, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. So one version of Montgomery known as the cradle of the Confederacy, and the other version as the birthplace of civil rights. A mile away from the first White House of the Confederacy, there is also the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, dedicated in 2018 to the memory of thousands of victims lynched in America between 1877 and 1950. They have never been publicly commemorated until now. These are people who were lynched for such things as being disrespectful, for standing around, for bothering a white woman, or for having the temerity to try and vote, organize sharecroppers, report a crime, demand their wages, or for being associated with someone who did. These houses and memorials preserve contradictory historical narratives, one that actively remembers slavery and its legacy of lynching and inequality, and one that intentionally forgets that history. We might see it as a microcosm for the entire nation. It's not surprising that many of the townspeople from the old Montgomery opposed the lynching memorial, suggesting that it dug up the past unnecessarily, that it was better to let sleeping dogs lie, not to open old wounds, not to provoke anger and even violence. One local man told a reporter, quote, "It's a waste of money, a waste of space, and it brings up bullshit." Another said, "Bring that stuff to light and let it be, but don't dwell on it. We have moved past it. You don't want to entice them and feed any fuel to the fire." But I want to suggest we have not moved past it. Lynching threats are still happening today. Black Michigan lawmakers recently received multiple voicemails predicting that they would be lynched if they didn't award Michigan's electoral votes to Trump. In Georgia, Black middle school students received lynching threats via TikTok, saying they'd be lynched, skinned, and burned. At the Virginia Military Institute, Black cadets received lynching threats. And in Indiana, this past July, a video was made of a group of white men pinning a Black man to a tree and threatening to lynch him. They were only stopped by bystanders. Some question the accuracy of the numbers that the Equal Justice Initiative spent 6 years researching. It didn't seem possible to many that there could be more than 4,400 lynchings, men, women, and children, who were hanged, burned alive, shot, drowned, and beaten to death by white mobs. But as a resident of the new Montgomery said, quote, "This is something our children need to know so they can understand the struggle." Despite the local opposition fueled by the Trump administration, or maybe because of it, the memorial opened at a time when many are open to such a national reckoning, and it received front page coverage in the national and even international media. Remarkably, the local Montgomery Advertiser offered a critique of its own role in the past. Known as the leading paper of the Confederacy in the 19th century, It was historically opposed to lynching, but supported it in practice, reinforcing white supremacy right through the civil rights movement. The current 41-year-old editor, however, greeted the opening of the Lynching Memorial by printing the names of the victims from Alabama on the front page, alongside an editorial acknowledging and condemning the newspaper's complicity. This forthright act reminds us of the shameful role that newspapers once played in announcing lynchings before the fact, with date, time, and place. Lynchings were justified by presuming that Blackness was linked inextricably to criminality, and this presumption is still enforced today. Thus, remembering or forgetting the history of lynching constitutes two mutually exclusive ways of preserving history. Those who vigorously defend Confederate monuments in the South do so by arguing that they are part of Southern history. Indeed, they are part of a white supremacist history. But what about the history of racial violence? As poet Claudia Rankine observes, quote, "The condition of Black life is one of mourning," she writes, "dying in ship hulls, tossed into the Atlantic, hanging from trees, beaten, shot in churches, gunned down by the police, or warehoused in prisons. Historically, there is no quotidian without the enslaved, chained, or dead Black body to gaze upon or hear about or to position a self against," unquote. Since this violence is also part of American history, how should it be remembered? Minorities often create protected enclaves or preserves of memory, because without such commemorative vigilance, history would soon sweep them away. In other words, if what these preserves of memory commemorate was not threatened with denial or oblivion, perhaps there would be no need for them. As it is, preserving this memory must be insisted upon, precisely because of those who believe that we have moved past it. For many Southerners, to connect to a past of racial violence undermines their own sense of identity, hence their willingness to sweep this history away as bullshit, as something they have moved beyond, as something that may not even be true, despite the overwhelming evidence. To a great extent, lynching has evolved into the routine killing of Black people by the police and by right-wing fanatics. We can see this as the modern day form of lynching. By functioning as a counter-narrative to the ideology of the Confederacy and white supremacism, the Lynching Memorial performs a necessary form of commemorative vigilance that insists this history not be silenced or repressed. It functions as a site of resistance on behalf of the disenfranchised, the marginalized, and the bereaved, who still mourn the torture and killing of their ancestors, which after all was not so long ago. But it's not just a question of history, of recognizing and acknowledging the enormity of the loss, but of the ongoing racist violence and trauma. It's a question of how we understand the world today, the meaning we bestow on society in which we live, and the way we interpret ongoing events originates in the memory of our collective history. Sitting on a 6-acre site in downtown Montgomery, the memorial contains 800 steel columns, one for every county in the nation where lynching has occurred. And each column carries the names of victims lynched in that county. As the floor descends around a square courtyard, the steel columns hang above visitors' heads in ominous rows as stand-ins for the bodies. Some columns have unknown etched onto them among the names, creating an archive of lost names within the larger archive of the known. The memorial is the project of the Equal Justice Initiative, founded by Brian Stevenson, a Harvard-trained lawyer who created the EJI in 1994 to fight for justice for people on death row. He then became the driving force behind the Lynching Memorial and the Legacy Museum. Stevenson and a team of researchers combed through court records and local newspapers and talked to local historians and family members to document the lynchings. He found people who were lynched for knocking on a white woman's door, for failing to address a police officer as Mr., for bumping into a white girl while trying to catch a train. Yet despite the thousands of people killed, Stevenson notes that Americans cannot name a single person. The National Lynching Memorial, officially known as the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, therefore names names. Naming the victims turns them into grievable bodies and produces an archive of memory. Lynching was a product of modernity, not an effect of rural or Southern backwardness. Wealthy planters and employers feared an alliance between poor whites and poor Blacks and fostered economic competition between them for access to land and jobs in response to urbanization and industrialization. By supporting and facilitating competition and racial violence, the wealthy capitalists helped to keep wages down and maintain the power of the white patriarchal elite, which regarded Blacks, in any case, as less than fully human. The fostering of economic antagonism between the races prevents the joint struggle and natural alliance of poor whites and Blacks. Instead, tying poor whites to the wealthy white elite. We see this continuing today. Racial violence was also rooted in gender anxieties that especially criminalize sexual relations between Black men and white women, while looking the other way at the rape of Black women by white men. White supremacists feared the enfranchisement and education of Black Americans that might further such relations and destabilize the white-dominated power structure by blurring the color line through intermarriage. Thus, we see the continuing attempt to disenfranchise Black people. Lynching was therefore part of a struggle over racial and national identity that affected everyone because whiteness was defined only in relation to Blackness. But as a socially constructed phenomenon, race, like skin color, is unbounded and contingent, making whiteness a slippery category that is always threatened and always in need of defense. I want to talk for a minute about other memorials. Other memorials also produce names, name names, and produce an archive of memory. When the medieval Pincus Synagogue in Prague's Old Jewish Quarter was turned into a memorial to Holocaust victims in the 1950s, the interior walls were covered with more than 77,000 names of Jews who had been sent to their deaths in Auschwitz. Likewise, the power of the 1982 Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. is the 58,000 names of soldiers who died in that war, etched onto its converging walls. Visitors often come to make crayon or pencil rubbings of a family name. Two other memorials to the Holocaust take a seemingly opposite approach. One is Rachel White-Reed's Holocaust Memorials to Austria's 65,000 lost Jews, a cast concrete inverted library, which you see on the left, and the right is a detail. It has doors with no handles or hinges, and the spine of every book is turned away from the viewer, creating a world of untold stories. This is a lost or unknown archive, representing the silencing of whole generations, their unwritten futures sealed in concrete. Loss is represented by loss. In the same way, Peter Eisenman's Field of Stele, which became the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe near the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, consists of an undulating field of some 3,000 gray stone pillars, which also signals the unwritten legacy of the millions of Jews who were killed. Like the Lynching Memorial that was inspired by this memorial, the stone pillars recall anonymous headstones, caskets, and ancient stelae. They become stand-ins for the bodies themselves. Eisenman's and White Reed's memorials act as counter-monuments and negative form designs that in themselves remember nothing specific, yet they paradoxically act as counter-memories to a history of forgetting, as sites of resistance on behalf of the forgotten, in the same way that the Lynching Memorial does. Yet all of these memorials are abstract and open-ended, like the trauma they memorialize. The accretion of thousands of names, in the end, has a parallel effect to the blank pillars, each producing an overwhelming sense of collective absence and loss. Through individual naming or a sea of blankness, they make explicit a history prone to denial and forgetting. The Lynching Memorial combines these two approaches, employing both the unknown archive with the specificity of memorials that focus on naming. Historian James Young observes that the job of such memorials is to, quote, articulate this terrible loss without filling it with consoling meaning, unquote. Like all these monuments, the Montgomery Lynching Memorial represents an enormous void of loss without attempting to fill it with consoling or redemptive meaning. The accompanying Legacy Museum is located on the site of a former warehouse where Black people were enslaved in Montgomery, and near where slave traders once sold men, women, and children alongside livestock at slave depots. The museum also refused a message of uplift and constructs a narrative in which slavery evolves to lynching, to segregation, and then to mass incarceration. We know that racial discrimination continues today in jobs, housing, healthcare, and education, contributing to the double oppression of class and race. It continues through the disproportionate imprisonment of Black men and the everyday harassment and murder of Black people by police on the streets of American cities, which has given rise to the Black Lives Matter movement. It also continues through cold-blooded racist killings by white supremacists. As the legacy of slavery and segregation, Black oppression remains the foundation of racist capitalist America, even when a Black president occupied the White House, and especially with a white nationalist in the White House. One of the most affecting displays at the Legacy Museum are the jars of soil collected from lynching sites around the nation. The soil itself becomes the trace and material vestige of what has occurred, embodying the blood and tears of the tortured. Like urns of ashes, the jars of soil evoke the bodies of the dead, connecting place, identity, and the body. There are many examples of racial violence in the recent past. In 2015, for example, Dylan Roof, a 21-year-old white supremacist, massacred 9 Black men and women at a historic Black church in Charleston, South Carolina. In a manifesto found on Roof's website, he cites his, quote, awakening by the 2012 killing of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, a neighborhood vigilante who shot Martin in the chest because the unarmed young man in a hoodie looked, quote, suspicious. As we know, Zimmerman was acquitted of the crime. Dylan Roof also drew inspiration from the Council of Conservative Citizens and the Northwest Front, both white supremacist organizations, and posted photos of himself such as this one, posing with segregationist symbols and the Confederate flag, another symbol of racist terror. In the 2 weeks following the mass shooting at the church, 8 Black churches were torched, recalling the hundreds of church fires set by the Ku Klux Klan over a long and sordid history. The cop who arrested 28-year-old Sandra Bland in Texas in 2015 for failing to signal while changing lanes, yanked her out of her car and slammed her head into the ground. 3 days later, she was found hanging in her jail cell. While the police claimed suicide, her family and friends found that difficult to believe. They wondered why an inexplicably high level of THC was found in her bloodstream, and a pasty white discharge was found at the entrance of her vagina. According to the autopsy report, was she drugged and raped while in custody and lynched to silence her? Waller County, where Sandra Bland's arrest and death occurred, had among the highest number of lynchings in the state of Texas, according to the report by the Equal Justice Initiative. We all know there are plenty of other examples of continuing racial violence, including the recent killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Trump's immigration war against Muslims and Central Americans and his objection to accepting immigrants from Haiti, El Salvador, and unspecified countries in Africa because they are, quote, shithole countries, while endorsing the acceptance of immigrants from countries such as Norway, is yet another example of white supremacist ideology intent on rolling back the gains of the civil rights movement. At stake is the attempt to define who can be an American citizen and who is not qualified to have that right. This is the battle that began with the fight over freedom versus slavery at the founding of this country. Immigration quotas based on country of origin were the rule of law for most of the 20th century. The Immigration Act of 1924, which included the National Origins Act and the Asian Exclusion Act, restricted immigration based on perceived racial desirability. It was aimed at Southern and Eastern Europeans, especially Italians, Slavs, and Jews, who were not considered white. It severely restricted Africans and outright banned Arabs and Asians. It severely restricted immigration overall. The racial theories promoted by eugenicists and social theorists aimed at preserving what was called the Nordic race informed this legislation, which became the basis for the official ideology of Nazi Germany. Enacted at the height of the Jim Crow era, this restrictive immigration law stood until the Civil Rights era, when Congress repealed the per-country quotas in the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. The total number of immigrants has grown overall in recent years, greatly alarming conservatives who fear that this disturbingly high proportion of the American population will be foreign-born. For Trump and the reigning criterion for American citizenship appears to be native-born whiteness. The current backlash is thus a reaction to the browning of America, with Trump's restrictive proposals aimed at countries that were once subject to colonial domination. The struggle for the rights of citizenship is therefore also a struggle for racial equality. Migrants and refugees fleeing war, climate change, poverty, and persecution are struggling for the right to immigrate to the US. Is it still the mission of America to serve as a haven for the persecuted and the oppressed? What does it mean for global migrants to have no citizenship anywhere and therefore no human rights? It appears to mean that anything can be done to them, as if they are zombie hordes. They can be separated, incarcerated, fenced out, caged in, left to drown on the high seas, to die of thirst in the desert, or to contract COVID in crowded detention centers. It is well known that the trauma migrants and refugees already suffer from displacement and dislocation is even worse for children separated from their parents, as we see here. We might also ask, do African Americans have the same rights as whites in America? For the state, Blackness itself is a threat that must be contained and controlled, as demonstrated by the regular killings of unarmed Black people by the police with virtually no repercussions for the cop killers. Although the police keep no count, record the killings, estimate that approximately 100 Black Americans per month since 2013 have died at the hands of police in near daily assaults, totaling more than 1,000 deaths per year, according to the website Killed by Police and other sources. Today, as in the past, police serve as frontline defenders of a racist system that is built on the repression of the poor and the non-white in the service of a tiny, wealthy elite, the only ones to whom the cops are accountable. For them, Black protest against racist oppression is not a right in a democracy, but a form of terrorist violence. This is a political cartoon, which you see three men subduing a Black man saying, "Don't worry, sir, we've restrained the intruder." And the man saying, "That's our diversity trainer." The state regards the killing of Black people not as an effect of the racist state, but as the result of individual aberrations. In the case of white nationalists stemming from mental illness, or in the case of the police requiring greater sensitivity training. Individual psychology, however, flows from the institutionalization of racism, which long ago turned the American dream of upward mobility through hard work into a bitter joke. For many, the American condition is instead an almost inescapable downward spiral. Even wealthy and accomplished Blacks are as vulnerable as poor ones to racial profiling and harassment, as we see here when Harvard University professor Henry Louis Gates was arrested at his own front door in Cambridge after a neighbor reported him trying to break into his own home. When white nationalists, including neo-Nazis and the Klan, held a rally in Charlottesville in 2017, a car plowed into a group of anti-racist protesters, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer and injuring 19 others. Yet as we know, Trump refused to denounce the white nationalist rally, claiming that both sides included some very fine people. Perhaps Trump had in mind his own father, Fred Trump, one of 7 men arrested on Memorial Day in 1927, when 1,000 white-robed Klansmen marched through a Jamaican neighborhood in Queens, New York, inciting a brawl with police. Fred Trump was also notable for his racial discrimination against potential tenants in the real estate and construction business. In 1973, the US Justice Department's Civil Rights Division sued Fred Trump and his company for refusing to rent apartments to Black people after the Urban League sent Black and white testers to apply for apartments he owned. Only whites got the apartments. The rise of neo-Nazism in America has attained a national profile since Trump's election in 2016. Many have remarked on the parallels between Hitler and Trump. Hitler admired the slaughters that took place in Europe, such as the Armenian genocide, but he was truly inspired by America and its enslavement of African Americans. He was also encouraged by the doctrine of manifest destiny and the murder of Native Americans, which has been compared to the doctrine of Lebensraum. He was influenced by the racist ideas of Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh, the American eugenics movement, and especially American race laws. American eugenicists were openly racist, and California's sterilization program directly inspired the Nazi sterilization law of 1934. Today, we have reports of doctors performing unnecessary hysterectomies on migrant women in detention centers. Hitler also praised American restrictions on immigration following the Immigration Act of 1924, which also prevented thousands of Jews from escaping to America during the Holocaust. Since entering office, Trump has been compared repeatedly to Hitler, including by the American Nazi Party and the Klan, who were enthused and emboldened when he hired the proudly racist, Hitler-loving Steve Bannon as his chief of staff. This is the KKK paper Stormfront, celebrating Bannon's appointment. Bannon recently endorsed violence against Anthony Fauci, the nation's leading infectious disease expert. Just a word about Confederate monuments. I'm showing you the largest Confederate monument in existence, dedicated in 1970. Black Democratic gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams called for its removal by sandblasting, and civil rights movements have called for its removal for years. This is a huge carving on Stone Mountain, showing 3 Confederate leaders on horseback. Confederate monuments across the South were primarily erected in the 1910s during the women's suffrage movement and in the 1960s during the civil rights movement. They were intended to intimidate Black people politically and to reassert white supremacy. But the issue of gender is also important because it was the upper class white women of the United Daughters of the Confederacy that sponsored many of these monuments in the 1910s. They opposed the vote for women and wanted to hold onto a way of life that reinforced traditional gender roles where women stayed at home and raised children. White supremacists today still see feminism as a scourge. Male supremacy has joined with white supremacy to preach the inferiority of women, who they believe exists primarily for their reproductive and sexual functions. Defenders of Confederate monuments today are mostly downwardly mobile, lower middle class white men that experience economic displacement. They attempt to reclaim both Southern masculinity and virility in the face of the South's defeat in the Civil War, and to reclaim their own masculinity in response to a felt sense of emasculation by the gains of women and their downwardly mobile economic status, which is the fault of capitalism and not women or Blacks. So white nationalist organizations offer a sense of belonging to men who are angered by their economic status, and also offer a restored sense of masculinity by insisting on gender essentialism and the subordination of women. White nationalists embrace the conspiracy theory of the Great Replacement or white replacement, which suggests there is a concerted plan to replace whites with non-whites through immigration, abortion, intermarriage, and racial integration. But fear of replacement is not new. It also blossomed in the Jim Crow era when conservative Southerners feared their racial eclipse by freed slaves and Northerners who moved south. So Confederate monuments not only uphold a racial hierarchy, but also a class and gender hierarchy. By emplacing Black history, Legacy Museum and the National Lynching Memorial strike a blow against the culture of silence that existed around lynching and offer public legitimation of Black memory and history through a confrontation with the past. The past is not only Black history, but American history. To combat the erasure of history, we must acknowledge and commemorate the history of injustice and persecution. Collective memory is not a passive thing, but a field of activity in which past events are selected, reconstructed, and endowed with political meaning. I'd like to end with the COVID-19 memorials and marches for the dead that have sprung up in our country. Despite almost 300,000 dead, there have been no official memorials or remembrances of this ongoing national trauma. Although I did hear that Governor Whitmer lowered the flag in honor of the 10,000 dead in Michigan today. But the lack of national forms of mourning or remembrance suggests that these losses don't matter and this pain doesn't count. Indeed, as we all know, Trump has downplayed the virus from the beginning, insisting on silence and intentional forgetting. But people refuse to forget. These are two contemporary memorials in Brooklyn and in the Bronx in New York, where the names of the dead have been posted. And this is the nation's first citywide memorial to honor the dead who died from COVID and did not have funerals. It was produced on Belle Isle Park in Detroit in early September of this year. 15 consecutive funeral processions drove past more than 900 photos of loved ones on what Mayor Duggan declared was Detroit Memorial Day. Such public commemoration and acknowledgement allows for collective mourning and grieving. It also allows us to recognize that the virus has disproportionately affected Black and Brown Americans. Like the Montgomery Lynching Memorial, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and the Holocaust Memorials, these memorials attempt to change the official narrative, to provide a space for public truth-telling, to acknowledge the trauma, to honor the dead, and to change our perspective going forward. And I want to end with a plug for my book here, which this talk is based on a chapter in Calling Memory into Place, where I examine ways in which memory can be mobilized for a continuously changing understanding of the past and of ourselves, of history and culture in the service of social justice, and how inherited trauma might be channeled in productive ways. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dora.
Thank
I
you.
would be surprised if there were no questions asked, so that if you want to ask a question or to make a comment, please indicate that, and Dora will, I see that Andrea has put up her hand, so we'll go to her. Andrea, please unmute yourself. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the relationship between the personal and the sort of larger systemic issues. And I was wondering, I mean, this is one of the wonderful things about Dora's book, that it does that very precisely, in that you have these personal recollections, but put in a larger historical frame. From the title of the talk is, do we need a national monument um, of dedicated to lynching victims? And I'm sometimes worried about how that might take away from a sort of an anti um, systemic critique, or how can a national monument, I don't know if I'm articulating this very well, but how can a national monument sort of foreground the personal, like the the Vietnam Memorial, and maybe one could sort of widen it um, in a across the country. So I don't know. I just wanted to know if you could maybe address this relationship between the systemic violence and the personal victims, and the problems that might arise if we personalize things too much.
This is an interesting question. I'm not sure I really understand it, though. Um,
It's the whole question of if we focus so much on the personal suffering of these individuals, is that sort of a corollary to the bad apple notion when it comes to police violence? How can you kind of resolve that tension, between the institutionalization, the systemic violence, and their victims, the individuals? You want to personalize it more, you want to make them more human. And of course, that will get through to people on an individual level. But could it possibly detract, from, a sort of a larger macrocosmic historical?
so are you referring not only to the lynching memorial, but the Holocaust memorials, the Vietnam memorial, suggesting they all, perhaps by focusing on the names, take away from the causes?
Yeah, and
So,
I mean, and I think it's
okay,
essential that we have this kind of combination, this fusion of the personal and the larger systemic. But maybe find
right,
ways of reminding people as they're standing there grieving, as they're reading the names, to
yes.
constantly look at it in a larger historical context.
Well,
Like,
okay. I think that's the function of the museum. I think that's why you need both memorials and, in this case, the Legacy Museum, which I think it's uh, too much to ask of memorials to look at causes. But because it's a larger complex subject, and that's something that can be taken up um, in the museums and education centers and so forth, so that um, the memorials are, but even by documenting events which suggest such an enormity of loss, it raises the question, even if the monument itself can't answer it, of how could this happen? And that's a question that to then be pursued elsewhere. um, but I think that's an important tension. I think the personal is continuous with the collective, and we don't want to ignore one in favor of the other. And so it's a kind of tension that has to be constantly maintained, that the overarching causes and social structures that create the losses um, are certainly crucial, but the individual losses also have to be mourned and grieved. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I'll have to think about it.
it's all about art history, isn't it? In a way, too. It's yeah, it's the collective versus the individual memory, and yeah.
Mhm.
Well, there are three questions in the chat. The first one says, how do you think we should deal with Confederate statues? Do we leave them, tear them down, get rid of them, or place them in a new space that remembers instead of glorifies, or create something new altogether? That was one. And then the other was maybe you want to deal with the two of them together. I wonder if we would change minds if white supremacists had DNA assays showing their genetic backgrounds, these would be provided free. So I don't know. They're two
Well,
different questions, but you might be able to find a way to answer.
yeah, I mean, taking the latter question first, yes, this is why we talk about race being a social construction, because you know, there's the truth is we're all very mixed, and what does it mean anyway? But in terms of Confederate monuments, this of course is an ongoing question, what to do with them. And I think there are a number of options, which are some of which are mentioned, and that it has to be decided on a case-by-case basis. And there are a lot of parties that can have input into that. But so you can move them, you can add things to them, you can provide context, you can hide them away, you can destroy them. There are a lot of options depending on where they are, what they are, who they affect. So I don't think there's just one right answer to that.
Another question was that said, your talk reminded me of British brutality in India when they occupied India. Current Indians do not want to remember it or see any benefit of it. What argument can one make to memorialize it?
Yes, colonial history is a very brutal history that also needs to be commemorated and remembered.
And it's also worth noting, according to one chatter, that Washington, D.C. Is in the South, and the White House was built by slave labor. Also, as pointed out in your book, the early economy of the United States was totally dependent on slavery. So a national memorial might include the horrible legacy of slavery itself and should be in DC.
Yes, good point. I think the reason it was located in Montgomery is because Montgomery became the primary hub for slave trading in the South. At one point that was New Orleans, but then it was overtaken by Montgomery. So that's the reason for choosing that site. But certainly, one of the interesting things that they've done at the National Lynching Memorial is create a duplicate of the more than 800 hanging stelae. And those duplicates are available for the counties around the nation where lynchings took place, are available for those counties to take one of them and place them somewhere in their county as a commemorative monument. And it'll be interesting to see which counties do that and which ones refuse.
I tried to write in the chat and I couldn't master that technology.
Okay.
But I wanted to make a comment about the distinction between focus on systemic and the personal. And that comment is, which I'm aware of because I worked for a long time in a museum, is that for the systemic, those people who understand the systemic issues will understand the personal, and they are already there. They're already in the realm of understanding what's going on. When you put something into the personal, there is an attraction to understanding that touches the individual who's engaged in it, as well as the individual who was victimized. And it can pull that individual into an, an interest or desire to understand more of the systemic. It's like when you look at an artwork, if you don't already know a lot about art when you walk into an art museum, to for the staff to appeal to the personal in the visitor brings that visitor closer to understanding the art. And so I think that the emphasis on the personal is extremely important to lead people into an understanding or an exploration of the systemic.
Yeah, I agree. I think the emphasis on the personal allows an empathic connection, and it's able to create empathy in a way that larger numbers don't, and it can create empathy for people whose experience is very different from your own. And that's absolutely crucial. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, absolutely.
Hi, Dora.
Hi, Harry.
This is a perception from the classroom. And it's one of the things I think perhaps to emphasize, and that's this. It is possible for students, especially in northern schools, and this is my own perception, when we talk about lynching, they see it largely as a Southern phenomena. And if it's a Southern phenomena, they distance themselves from those kinds of actions if it's in fact correct that it's largely something out of the North. And what I would want you to speak to is, if that is the perception, how one deals with it. And perhaps one of the ways to deal with that is to talk about over the years where there was attempts to have federal anti-lynching legislation from the 1890s into the 1960s, which is a whole period where lynching most occurs. What were the problems among Northerners and Westerners in Congress, which made it impossible to pass such federal anti-lynching law in those years?
I think you have the answer to that. Why don't you tell us?
Well, it's actually more complicated than that. It's not. And part of that has to do, of course, with this perception of states' rights. I mean, even most recently in Congress, when the House of Representatives voted on a form of an anti-lynching law, the vote was 410-4, which is interesting that we get this in 2018 or 19. The four people who opposed the anti-lynching law, even now, the assertion they made was it was based on states' rights. And I think if you go back and look at Northerners who were reluctant to pass federal anti-lynching law in those years, they stepped back, not to issues of supposed race, but hid behind this notion of states' rights, which can become a way to mask other kinds of perceptions. And this notion of states' rights is something that will continue to follow us in to the court we're about to see, the conservative court, that we're going to see a return to this notion of states' rights. But it's an interesting issue for students, because my understanding over the years has been they can distance themselves from lynching because they'll look at it as that's what those people down there did. That's not something we could have done here. And that hides the larger issue, which is what's really going on here at a national level. Just a perception.
Yeah, we kind of saw the resuscitation of the idea of states' rights in the way that Trump handled the COVID pandemic, refusing to offer national mandates. And of course, I'm sure you make students aware that lynchings did take place in the North, you know, from Maine to Washington State. There was a lynching in Detroit. Yeah, but the ideology of states' rights became a way for the South to justify their role in the Civil War, as opposed to defending slavery. And that is an ideology that continues. Yep. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Hello from Toronto, Dora.
Vera,
Yes.
hi.
It's great to see you, and I'm glad to learn about the book. I didn't know about it, and it looks wonderful. Thank you. My question is, who originated the memorial in Detroit, that very compelling memorial with all the photographs?
Who originated that? That is a good question. I'm not sure. Does anyone know? I will have to research that and get back to you.
I just wondered if it came from the community or if there was any municipal support.
I'm not entirely certain. I mean, certainly the mayor did support it, but whether, I mean, my instinct is that it came from the community, but I don't know for sure.
Well, I was just curious because it really was very compelling.
Yes, I agree, but I'll look into it. I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. And I also want to apologize. I was taking frame captures of the images and I didn't mute. And your organizer very wisely muted me. I just want to apologize for the clicking. I didn't know there was a book, so I wanted to capture the images. So my apologies for that noise.
No problem. And all those images are not in the book anyway, so.
Okay, well, I can send them to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just one last question, because this in the chat, Vince says that in your book, you noted that more and more memorializing has increasingly abundant redemptive themes and imagery for those of loss and other forms of trauma. My questions are, one, what does that say about our culture and our increasing polarization socially, politically? And two, do you have examples of commemorations that are available to help us move things forward? Or as Jameson once noted, can we imagine a future? That's from Vince.
Well, I'd like to think that there's always a way forward and that we can imagine a future. I think when all these, in a future of where equality reigns, we won't need these kinds of memorials anymore. But it was the 19th century memorials that were largely heroic and celebratory. And I think it was after World War I and the massive losses of World War I when the non-redemptive memorial first arose. And the example I know of is by the German artist Ernst Barlach and the Gustav Angel in Germany, which it was still a figurative memorial, but it was only about sorrow and loss and mourning. The Nazis destroyed that memorial and it was recreated after World War II and then became a memorial for both world wars. And since then, probably starting with Maya Lin's memorial in the 60s, the non-redemptive memorial in its abstract form has become dominant. Although even then, if some of you may recall, there was a backlash to Maya Lin's memorial and a heroic figurative memorial with 3 soldiers carrying weapons was created and placed nearby the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I'm not sure anybody goes there. So what does it say about our society? We've gotten very good at genocide and major destruction and killing. And we need a different kind of system where that doesn't happen. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Vince. I have to think about this more. Maybe you want to comment on what you think it says, Vince.
Well, I just, it's just an observation, and I wish I had a better point of view. In your book, the underlying thing, and you've mentioned it a couple times, is the C word, right? Capitalism. And, its inextricable connection to race. And as you say, that's a lot for us to unpack before moving forward. And I just, have my anxiety that any attempt to basically represent some notion of quote unquote the future will always have underneath it, this is, and you quote Benjamin, as we all do. My favorite Benjamin quote is, every document of civilization is at the same time a document of barbarism. So, it's really, the question was just really to be provocative, I guess, And as you know, I tremendously admire your work. I think you're the best. Anyway, and congratulations on the book. It's fantastic.
So maybe we should let Edward Hillel have the last say, because he said, thank you very much for seeking the truth and for giving us this talk.
Well, thank you all for participating in this. I really appreciate it. It's good to see everybody.
All right.
Thank you, Walter. And I thank the Humanities Center.
Wonderful. And we thank you. You've been a very good friend of the center. You've sort of participated in our programs. You have held our most prestigious award, which is our Marilyn Williamson Endowed Distinguished Faculty Fellowship. You've also held our regular faculty fellowships. You have given talks in our symposia and so on. You've been a very good friend. And now Kennedy has a little wrap up to say.
Yeah, I think Dr. Edwards said it all, but I thank you so much for participating in this talk and helping to facilitate some meaningful discussion. I think talks like this are very important and why we do what we do at the Humanities Center. So we're glad that we can give you the platform to share this knowledge with us. I thank the audience for attending. This was a well-attended talk, so we're thankful you all can join us. But as a special and a small token of our gratitude, we do have a couple gifts for our speaker. It's a journal and a mask with the Humanities Center logo on it. We always try to give our speakers gifts in person, but because of the coronavirus, things have changed. So we'll be reaching out to you individually later on in the semester to safely get these gifts to you. But again, thank you so much. You've definitely been a joy to work with and a joy to listen to this talk. And everyone, be safe and have a wonderful week and happy holidays. Dora, if you have anything else to say, or Dr. Edwards, you can close it out.
No, thank you, Kennedy.
Just thanks again. And tell Dora I'm still waiting for my copy of the book, but if I don't get it, I'll just send you a check and get a copy from you.
And this talk is being recorded, so it will be up on our website towards the end of the week. And any questions in the chat that weren't answered, I'm going to send off to Dora. So if you have anything else to say.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
All right, everyone have.
Yeah, no, Walter, send me a different address to have that book sent.
Okay, thank you. I will.
All right, everyone have a good
Bye,
one.
everyone.